64 million years ago, in a dry stretch of what is now New Mexico, a hadrosaur may have taken a step it should not have been able to take. The asteroid had already fallen. The sky had already darkened. Every textbook says the non-avian dinosaurs were gone. And yet, in 2009, a quiet geologist named James Fassett published something the world was not quite ready for. He claimed that bones from the Alamo sandstone were not Cretaceous strays washed into younger rock. They were genuine Paleocene survivors, uranium lead dating, paleomagnetic signatures. Settle in and do me a small favour. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from. Part 1. The bone that should not exist. There is a bone lying in the red sandstone of New Mexico that, according to one stubborn geologist, should not exist. It is a fragment of a duck-billed dinosaur. It is heavy, mineralized, ancient, and if the man who studied it was right, it is younger than the asteroid that supposedly killed every non-bird dinosaur on Earth. Picture it for a moment. A piece of hadrosaur lying inside rock that some researchers argued was not 66 million years old, but closer to 64 or 64.5 million years old. That is roughly 1.5 million years after the impact at Chicxulub, 1.5 million years after the sky burned, 1.5 million years after, in every textbook ever written for a school child, the last non-avian dinosaur drew its final breath. If that bone is what one geologist said it is, then everything you have been told about the end of the dinosaurs has a small, uncomfortable footnote at the bottom of the page. A footnote that will not stop bothering you the more you read it. We have always been told the dinosaurs were ended in a single, terrible afternoon. But what if a few stragglers, somewhere out in the dark, walked on for a little longer? What if the obituary was written too soon? The mainstream story is clean, and it is, in most ways, almost certainly correct. 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly the size of a small city slammed into the shallow sea, covering what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The shock wave, the heat, the global darkness, and the collapse of food chains wiped out around 3/4 of all species on Earth. Among the dead were every non-avian dinosaur lineage we know of. The American Museum of Natural History puts it plainly. Birds are the only dinosaur group that survived the mass extinction. Crocodilians, turtles, snakes, lizards, frogs, salamanders, and our own small mammalian ancestors crawled, slithered, swam, and scurried into the next chapter. The big dinosaurs did not. That is the story. That is the line. And then there was James Fassett. Fassett was not a fringe theorist shouting from the wilderness. He was a serious geologist who worked for the United States Geological Survey, a man who spent decades walking the dry, cracked badlands of the San Juan Basin in northwestern New Mexico, mapping rock layers, collecting fossils, and slowly building a case that nobody else wanted to believe. He was not a young researcher chasing fame. He was an old hand, walking the same hills that he had walked since he was much younger, and the longer he walked them, the stranger the bones in those hills appeared to him. In 2009, he published work arguing that certain dinosaur fossils preserved in the Alamo sandstone and in another rock unit called the Animus Formation were not stray Cretaceous bones washed into younger rock by accident. They were, he claimed, the genuine remains of dinosaurs that had been alive after the asteroid hit, real Paleocene dinosaurs. Animals walking, breathing, and eating in a world that, according to everyone else, no longer had room for them. Now, before we go any further, let me hand you a small toolkit, because we are about to walk into a stratigraphic crime scene, and you will need the language to follow the clues. Palynology is the study of fossil pollen and spores. Tiny grains of plant material locked in rock can act like microscopic timestamps because plants evolve and disappear through deep time. Paleomagnetism is the study of the ancient magnetic field of the Earth, frozen into the orientation of magnetic particles inside certain rocks. The Earth's magnetic field has flipped many times over its history, and those flips leave a fingerprint. Uranium-lead dating is a radioactive clock where uranium decays into lead at a known rate, and the ratio between them tells you, in theory, how long ago a mineral formed. Taphonomy is what happens to a body after death. The decay, the burial, the transport in rivers, the slow chemical changes, the eventual erosion that brings a fossil back to the surface millions of years later. Hold those 4 ideas in your head, because Fassett used all of them. The core problem, the one that haunts this entire mystery, is this. A dinosaur bone can end up inside a Paleocene rock for 2 completely different reasons. Either the dinosaur was alive when that rock was forming and died there and was buried there, or the dinosaur died long before in older Cretaceous rock, and millions of years later a river cut into that older rock, ripped the fossil out, dragged it downstream and dumped it into younger sediment. Same bone, same rock. 2 completely different stories. One rewrites the history of life on Earth. The other is just a river doing what rivers do. Fassett believed it was the first story, the Paleocene story, the impossible story. And then, just when this debate seemed to be settling into a slow, grinding stalemate, came a twist from the year 2025. A new study, published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world, took a long, hard look at a nearby rock unit called the Narshoi Beto member. The result reframed everything. Those New Mexico dinosaurs were not survivors. They were dated to roughly 66.4 to 66 million years ago, astonishingly close to the asteroid, but still before it. Baylor University summarized the result with an image that is hard to forget. A dinosaur ecosystem, complex and functioning, thriving right up until the moment the sky fell. So which is it? Did James Fassett find the fossil equivalent of survivors hiding in the rubble of the apocalypse? Or did the rocks themselves play a beautiful, almost perfect trick on him? Did the rivers of an ancient New Mexico sweep old bones into new graves and create a geological illusion convincing enough to keep one good scientist arguing for the rest of his life? To find out, we cannot just look at the bone. We have to look at the room it was found in. We have to look at the witnesses. We have to look at the timestamps on the walls. We have to treat the San Juan Basin like a crime scene. And like every good crime scene, the first thing we need to do is figure out exactly which layer of the floor we are standing on. Because in this case, the floor itself is a stack of stories, written one on top of the other, with whole chapters torn out and stitched back in again by ancient rivers that no longer exist. To read it, we are going to need to slow down, and we are going to need to look very, very closely. Part 2. The San Juan Basin as a stratigraphic crime scene. Imagine standing in northwestern New Mexico at the end of a long afternoon. The sun is low, the wind is dry, and the rock around you is the color of old blood and bleached bone. You are in the Badlands of the San Juan Basin, one of the most important fossil regions in all of North America. The walls of the dry washes around you preserve the final chapters of the age of dinosaurs, and the first quiet pages of the age of mammals, stacked one on top of the other, like a stained, water-damaged book that someone has tried, badly, to repair. Crows pass overhead. The basin stretches in every direction. There is a strange feeling in places like this, a sense that the ground is whispering, that the layers under your boots are full of names you do not know. Most visitors never feel it. But geologists, paleontologists, and the people who have walked these hills for years all describe something similar. A pull, an uneasy sense of standing on top of a story whose ending we have only partly read. If you have ever read about geology in a school book, you might have a clean image in your head. Layer cakes, neat horizontal stripes, older below, younger above, every page in order. Reality is not so polite. The San Juan Basin is not a layer cake. It is a basin shaped by ancient rivers, shifting coastlines, abrupt erosion, slow burial, and long pauses where nothing was deposited at all. Think of it less like a book and more like a manuscript, where some pages were torn out, others were spilled with ink, and a few were rewritten by water hundreds of thousands of years after the original was finished. The rough order, from older to younger, looks something like this. At the bottom, a series of older Cretaceous units rich with dinosaur fossils. Above them, the Kirtland Formation. Then the controversial Na-Shoibito member. Above that, the rock unit that sits at the center of our entire mystery, the Alamo sandstone. And finally, capping the sequence, the Nacimiento Formation, full of the small bones of early Paleocene mammals, the kind of creatures that were quietly inheriting the world. The Alamo sandstone is where the trouble lives. Different researchers have used different definitions for its lower and upper parts. Spencer Lucas and his colleagues, for example, argued that James Fassett treated the Alamo too much like one single package, when in fact it could be split into two separate bodies of rock with different fossils and different ages. Imagine arguing about whether a building has one floor or two, and then trying to figure out which floor the body was found on. That is essentially the debate. We have to add another concept here, and it has a strange, beautiful name: an unconformity. An unconformity is a missing chapter in the rock record, a place where, instead of layer after layer of sediment piling up, the surface was either eroded down or simply not building any new rock at all. Hundreds of thousands or even millions of years can vanish across the thickness of a fingernail. The page above is real. The page below is real. The pages between them are gone. Now, on top of all of this, you have to think about rivers. Rivers are the great editors of the fossil record. They build it up and they tear it down, and sometimes they do both in the same century. A river running across an old landscape can cut down through deep, ancient layers, picking up old fossils as it goes. Bones, teeth, and skeletons that lay quiet for millions of years can suddenly be ripped from their resting place, tumbled along a streambed, and dumped, perhaps gently, perhaps violently, into a new pile of much younger sand. Here is a small thought experiment to make this real. Imagine walking along the bank of a modern river in Europe, and you bend down and pick up a Roman coin. The coin is 2,000 years old, but the mud that buried it might have been deposited last spring. The coin is ancient. The mud is brand new. Now imagine that, in 66 million years, some future paleontologist tries to date the coin by dating the mud. They would conclude, completely incorrectly, that the Roman Empire was active sometime around our modern era. The coin tells one story, the matrix tells another. Both are true. Neither, on its own, is the answer. That is the trap of the Alamo. If a dinosaur fossil is found inside Paleocene sediment, the question is not just where the bone is. The question is whether the bone's biological age, the moment when the animal was alive, matches the depositional age, the moment when the surrounding sand was laid down. Those two ages can differ by hundreds of thousands of years. They can differ by millions. Let me lay out the metaphor clearly, because we are going to keep returning to it. The bone is the body, the sandstone is the room, the pollen, locked in the same sediment, is the witness who saw what happened. The magnetic signal, frozen into the rock, is the timestamp on the security camera. The chemistry inside the bone is the fingerprint, and reworking, that wonderful word, reworking, is the possibility that the body was moved before anyone arrived at the scene. Every great crime scene investigator knows the same uncomfortable truth. The body alone does not tell you when the death happened. You have to interrogate the room. You have to interview the witnesses. You have to look for inconsistencies, for signs that something has been disturbed, for the small details that betray a story that is too clean. There is one more thing to keep in mind before we go on. Rocks lie. They do not mean to. They are not malicious. But they are honest about only one thing at a time, and the thing they are honest about is not always the thing you are asking. A piece of sandstone is honest about the river that laid it down. It is not necessarily honest about the bone trapped inside it. The chemistry of a fossil is honest about the groundwater that passed through it. It is not necessarily honest about the year the animal died. Even the magnetic field, locked into a layer, is honest about when those iron-bearing minerals settled, which is not always the same moment when a passing dinosaur left a footprint nearby. Every line of evidence is its own narrow window. And in places like the San Juan Basin, where rivers have moved sediment around for tens of millions of years, those windows do not always look out on the same garden. That is exactly what James Fassett tried to do. He did not just look at the bones. He gathered witnesses. He checked the timestamps. He ran the chemistry. He believed every line of evidence pointed in the same direction. He believed the Alamo was telling him, calmly and clearly, that some dinosaurs had outlived the asteroid. In the next part, we walk through his case in detail. The pollen, the polarity, the chemistry, and that strange, enormous hadrosaur femur that some scientists insisted simply could not be a stranger washed in from another time. If he was right, this would be one of the most important discoveries in the history of paleontology. If he was wrong, it would be one of the most beautiful illusions ever produced by a river. Part 3. Fassett's case: pollen, polarity, chemistry, and hadrosaurs. There is a temptation, when you walk into a controversy in science, to immediately pick a side. The mainstream side is usually the safe bet, and most of the time it is also the correct one. But it is worth slowing down here, because the case James Fassett built was not a single argument. It was 4 arguments stacked on top of each other, and each one, on its own, would have made a reasonable scientist pause. This is a man who believed he had found something extraordinary, and who knew exactly how high the bar was. He did not present a single bone and ask the world to rewrite the textbooks. He presented an entire case file. The bones were Exhibit A. The pollen was Exhibit B. The magnetic field was Exhibit C. The geochemistry was Exhibit D. And the way he saw it, all 4 exhibits told the same story. The first witness Fassett called was pollen. Pollen seems like an unlikely hero in a story about dinosaurs. But in geological detective work, it is one of the most useful tools we have. Plants evolve, old plant species disappear, new ones arise. The microscopic grains of pollen and spores they release can be preserved in sediment, sometimes by the millions, and certain types are tied so tightly to specific time intervals that paleontologists can use them like little botanical timestamps. Show me the pollen, and I will show you, roughly, the age of the rock. Fassett argued that samples taken from the Alamo sandstone lacked the index pollen types you would expect from the Cretaceous, and instead contained pollen types known to come from the Paleocene. In other words, the witnesses in the room were Paleocene witnesses. They were not supposed to be there if the bones around them were truly Cretaceous and merely reworked. Then came the famous femur. In earlier work, Fassett and his colleagues described a hadrosaur thigh bone of staggering size, 1,310 millimeters long, roughly 130 kilograms in weight, massive, and located, by their measurement, just 3 meters above a shale bed that had produced Paleocene pollen. That shale bed itself sat about 12 meters above the base of the Alamo sandstone. So the picture they painted was this: Paleocene pollen down here, a dinosaur femur up there, the pollen below the bone above the pollen. If you trust both, the dinosaur was alive after the Paleocene plants were already in the world. And that femur, Fassett insisted, did not look like a stranger. He argued that it showed no signs of abrasion. It was not rounded, it was not battered, it was not polished by long miles inside a river. It was a clean, well-preserved femur, large and heavy, the kind of bone that, if it had really been ripped out of older rock and dragged for hundreds of thousands of years through ancient streambeds, ought to have looked far more beaten up than it did. To understand why this matters, picture the difference between a stone you find on a fresh hillside and a stone you find in the middle of a long, fast river. The hillside stone has sharp edges. The river stone is round, smooth, sometimes almost polished. Bones behave the same way. Transport leaves marks. Lack of marks suggests a quiet death, a quick burial, and a rest that was not interrupted by water travel. Fassett's strongest physical evidence, though, was a single hadrosaur skeleton represented by 34 bones, all from the same individual, found in close association inside the Ojo Alamo. That number matters. Random scraps of bone in a river deposit you can explain away. A single individual with 34 pieces still found together is harder to dismiss. Bones from one animal that stay near each other usually suggest they were not transported far. They were not tumbled. They were not endlessly recycled. They were buried, more or less, where they died. Then came his second timestamp, paleomagnetism. The Earth's magnetic field flips, sometimes spectacularly, on geological timescales. North becomes south, south becomes north. Iron-bearing minerals in fresh sediment line up like compass needles, and when the sediment hardens, that orientation gets locked in place. Read the orientation, and you read the polarity of the magnetic field at the time the rock formed. Fassett argued that, in several Ojo Alamo localities, his team identified a normal polarity interval matching what geologists call C29N. That is an early Paleocene magnetic chron, not Cretaceous. Paleocene, another witness, another timestamp pointing the same way. His final argument was chemistry. Fassett claimed that uranium concentrations and rare earth element patterns in dinosaur bones from the Ojo Alamo were different from the patterns in dinosaur bones from the older Kirtland Formation. The implication, in his view, was that the Ojo Alamo bones had absorbed their chemistry from the Ojo Alamo sediment itself soon after burial, rather than carrying an older chemical fingerprint left over from a Cretaceous home. If true, that would mean the bones were not strangers in the rock. They had been processed by the rock. They belonged. Think of it this way. When a bone is buried, water passes through it for thousands of years, leaving behind a chemical signature, a kind of slow tattoo that records the environment around the burial. If you could read that tattoo, you could in principle tell which rock the bone was first buried in. Bones from the Kirtland would carry one tattoo. Bones from the Ojo Alamo would carry another. If the Ojo Alamo bones had been transported in from older Kirtland rock, they should still carry traces of their original Kirtland tattoo, which would not match the surrounding sand. Fassett looked. He read the tattoo. He said it matched the Ojo Alamo. He said the bones belonged where they were found. Now, allow me a small moment of speculation, clearly labelled as such. If everything Fassett said was correct, then somewhere in the burned, half-dark world of the early Paleocene, in a wounded but recovering corner of southern North America, a small remnant population of duck-billed dinosaurs was still walking, still feeding, still raising young. Animals that by every textbook should have been ash. Listen to that for a moment. A small herd of hadrosaurs, scarred survivors, picking their way across ferns and fast-growing pioneer plants, while the new world of mammals quietly began to grow around their feet. Imagine the sounds, the crunch of plant matter, the low calls of large herbivores moving through a forest of ferns and stunted trees, the whir of insects, which had survived in great numbers, the distant cry of an unfamiliar bird, one of their cousins, perched somewhere in a half-dead conifer, watching them with an expression that, if such a creature could think, might have looked almost pitying. It is a beautiful story. But every piece of evidence Fassett presented had a second possible explanation. Every witness could be re-examined. Every timestamp could be challenged. Every piece of chemistry could be reread. And the scientists who challenged him did not pull their punches. The most pointed responses came from researchers who had been working in the same basin, on the same rocks, sometimes for almost as long as Fassett himself. They knew the Badlands. They knew the formations. And they thought he was, in their professional opinion, simply wrong. In the next part, we meet the counterattack. Part 4. The Counterattack. Reworked Dinosaurs and Broken Clocks. Spencer Lucas and his colleagues did not believe a word of it. Not the pollen, not the magnetic field, not the chemistry, not the femur, not the 34-piece skeleton, not any of it. In a series of papers and replies, they laid out what amounted to a complete dismantling of the Paleocene dinosaur claim. Their conclusion was blunt. There was no robust scientific basis, in their view, for assigning a Paleocene age to any dinosaur fossil in the San Juan Basin. None. Not one bone. The dinosaurs in the Alamo, they argued, were not living after the asteroid. They were Cretaceous animals whose bones had been picked up, carried, and dropped again by the relentless work of rivers. This is where reworking, that wonderful, dangerous geological word, becomes the central character of our story. Picture the sequence in slow motion. A duck-billed dinosaur dies in the late Cretaceous. Its body is buried in mud, its bones slowly mineralize, its flesh long gone, and for hundreds of thousands of years it lies still inside the rock that hardened around it. Then, gradually, the earth changes. New rivers cut new paths. Erosion strips away soil. The old rock is exposed at the surface. The fossil, once safely buried, now sits naked on a hillside. A flood comes. A river swells. The bone is washed loose, tumbled along the bottom of a stream, and eventually carried into a new floodplain where it is buried again, this time in much younger sand. Millions of years later, a paleontologist finds it. The bone is Cretaceous. The sand is Paleocene. And unless the scientist looks very carefully, the story will look like a survival. Lucas and his team argued that this is exactly what happened in the Alamo. They started with the rocks themselves. They distinguished between the Nashoy-Beto member and another part of the sequence called the Kimbeto member, and they argued that the dinosaur-bearing assemblages in the area were not all the same age, not all the same units, and not all telling the same story. To lump them together, in their view, was to confuse the picture beyond recognition. Then they went after the pollen. They pointed out that the famous Paleocene pollen samples below dinosaur bones were not as widespread as Fassett's framing suggested. They came from a limited number of localities, and the dinosaur bones in question were often isolated, sitting in sandy channel deposits, exactly the kind of context where reworking is most likely. Channels are not gentle resting places. They are highways for sediment and for the bones caught in it. They went after that big San Juan River femur too. Yes, it was large. Yes, it was apparently well preserved. But large bones, especially dense leg bones from massive animals, are exactly the kind of fossils that can survive being tumbled in a river without falling apart. And being well preserved is not the same as being undisturbed. A bone can be smooth and clean and still have travelled. Then came the chemistry counterpunch. Lucas and his colleagues argued that the geochemical signatures of the famous San Juan River hadrosaur, the rare earth element patterns and uranium values, actually overlapped, in some respects, with bones from the older Kirtland Formation. That is a very interesting move, because it uses Fassett's own logic against him. If chemistry can fingerprint a bone to a particular rock unit, and the chemistry of that hadrosaur looks more like a Kirtland fingerprint than an Alamo one, then perhaps the bone was originally a Kirtland animal, fossilized in older rock, and only later swept into its younger grave. Then the dating itself came under fire. Fassett, working with the geochronologists Larry Heeman and Antonio Simonetti, later reported uranium-lead dates obtained directly from dinosaur bone, dates clustering around 64 to 64.5 million years ago. That, on the surface, looks like a knockout punch. Direct dates on the fossil itself falling firmly inside the Paleocene. Game over. Except that another group of researchers, led by Alan Koenig, came back hard. They criticized the work for, in their view, lacking sufficient detail about the instruments used, the statistics applied, the diagenetic history of the bone, and the recrystallization that fossil bone can undergo over millions of years. To understand why this matters, you need to understand a basic, frustrating truth about fossil bone. Bone is not like a zircon crystal. A zircon is, for our purposes, a tiny sealed vault. Once formed, it tends to keep its uranium and lead inside, ticking away like a quiet clock. Fossil bone is the opposite. Fossil bone is more like a sponge. It is porous. It is chemically reactive. After burial, groundwater can flow through it for millions of years, depositing new minerals, exchanging elements, and even adding fresh uranium long after the animal is dead. So, when you measure uranium lead in a bone, you may not be measuring when the dinosaur died. You may be measuring when the bone last absorbed new uranium from the water around it. You are timing the rock's chemistry, not the animal's life. That is a profound problem. A bone that died in the Cretaceous and then sat for hundreds of thousands of years in Paleocene groundwater could, in theory, give you a Paleocene uranium lead age, even though the animal itself was much older. The clock would be honest. The clock would just be measuring something different from what you thought. Think about that the next time you read about a fossil being directly dated. The numbers are real. The numbers are precisely measured. The numbers are reproducible. But what those numbers actually represent depends on the closed system behavior of the material being dated. For zircon crystals, that closed system behavior is excellent. For fossil bone, it is famously bad. Geochronologists know this. They have known it for decades. It is one of the reasons most direct dates of dinosaur bones are treated with caution rather than trust. The standard for an extraordinary claim, in any science, is the same. You need multiple, independent, repeatable lines of evidence. You need fossils, you need dates, you need context. You need others to be able to walk into your field site, pick up a sample, and confirm what you saw. For Paleocene dinosaurs, that bar is enormous. And, in the eyes of most of the scientific community, it has not yet been cleared. There is a phrase Carl Sagan made famous. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It is not a slogan, it is a working principle. And the more astonishing your claim, the more you owe the rest of the world a way to check it. Fassett gave the world many bones, many measurements, many arguments. The world looked carefully and decided that, while interesting, his case was not enough. In the next part, the bar moves again, because in 2025, a new study reframed the entire New Mexico story and gave the question a much more careful answer than anyone had managed before. Part 5. The 2025. Reframe. Last dinosaurs, not surviving dinosaurs. The headlines, when they came in 2025, were quieter than you might expect. A new study, published in the journal Science, focused on a rock unit we have already met, the Na-Shoibito member, the dinosaur-rich layer that sits, geologically, just below the Alamo sandstone in much of the San Juan Basin. This study did not prove that Paleocene dinosaurs existed. Let us say that clearly, right at the start. It did not vindicate Fassett's claim. It did not place hadrosaurs in the Paleocene. What it did do, however, was reframe the entire conversation about the last dinosaur world of New Mexico. The team behind the study used two of the most reliable dating methods we have. The first was argon isotope dating, which works on certain crystals and grains in the sediment. Think of it as another radioactive clock, ticking slowly inside the minerals that were laid down at the same time as the dinosaur fossils. The second was paleomagnetism, the same magnetic field timestamp we discussed earlier, frozen into the iron-bearing particles inside the rock. When they put it all together, a clean answer fell out. The dinosaur-bearing rocks of the Na-Shoibito member were dated to roughly 66.4 to 66 million years ago. The journalists at Reuters described it neatly. By using the Earth's magnetic field direction and the slow decay of radioactive isotopes, the researchers placed the fossils about 340,000 years before the asteroid impact. 340,000 years. Astonishingly close. Geologically, that is the difference between a heartbeat and the moment after. These dinosaurs were not, by this evidence, survivors, but they were among the very last. They were standing on the very edge of the cliff, and the cliff still had ground under it. Now, who exactly was living in this final world? The Nashoibito member preserves a remarkable community of dinosaurs. Alamosaurus, an enormous long-necked plant-eater, possibly one of the largest sauropods to walk North America. Tyrannosaurs, sharp-toothed predators related to, though not identical to, the famous Tyrannosaurus rex of the northern plains. Torosaurus, with its huge frilled skull and forward-curving horns. Duck-billed hadrosaurs. Armored ankylosaur-type dinosaurs. Smaller, bird-like dinosaurs darting through the undergrowth. Reuters noted that the fauna covered multiple ecological niches and showed a clear north-south difference compared with the famous Hell Creek Formation up in Montana and the Dakotas. That word, niches, is doing a lot of work. It means roles, the big browser, the medium grazer, the predator at the top, the smaller predator just below, the scavenger, the egg-eater, the herbivore that specializes in tough plants, the omnivore that takes whatever it can get. A community that fills its niches is not a dying community, it is a working one. It is, in modern ecological terms, a balanced ecosystem, doing what ecosystems do, day after day, season after season. Picture them in your mind. Alamosaurus, that long-necked giant, grazing through the upper canopy with the slow patience of an enormous, gentle barn animal. A small herd of hadrosaurs moving along a riverbank in family groups, calling to one another, watching the shadows. A horned Torosaurus, almost certainly a relative of Triceratops, lowering its head to drink. A tyrannosaur, somewhere in the middle distance, standing motionless among the trees, watching everything. Above them all, the sky is hot and bright with the light of a slightly younger sun, and birds, real birds, the small feathered cousins of these giants, dart through the leaves on quick wings. For decades, one of the louder questions in paleontology has been whether the dinosaurs were already in decline before the asteroid hit. Some studies, particularly those focused on certain northern faunas, suggested that diversity was dropping in the final million years of the Cretaceous. Others disagreed. The Nashoibito data in this newer study points clearly toward the latter view, at least in the southwestern part of North America. These animals do not look like a fading remnant. They look like a thriving local ecosystem, well adapted to its environment, abruptly cut off near its peak. This nuance matters, and we should be careful with it. The paleontologist Michael Benton, when commenting more broadly on extinction debates, has cautioned that one locality is not the whole world. A community that looks healthy in New Mexico does not, by itself, prove that all dinosaur communities everywhere were healthy. There may have been regional declines, especially in the north, and global patterns can hide behind local exceptions. Still, the better way to frame the New Mexico evidence today is this. We are not looking at confirmed survivors of the asteroid. We are looking at some of the last functioning dinosaur worlds before it. That should change how you imagine that final morning 66 million years ago. Not a tired, dying group of stragglers, not an evolutionary loose end, a working ecosystem full of giants and small clever creatures, surrounded by ferns and conifers and flowering plants, with rivers winding through floodplains that smelled of mud and rotting wood, completely unaware that across the planet a kilometre-wide piece of rock was on the final approach. And then the question becomes more haunting, not less. If these animals were thriving so close to the end, what did the very next morning look like? What happened to the individuals who, by sheer luck of geography, were not killed in the first hours? Could any of them, anywhere in the world, have hung on into the early Paleocene, even briefly, even quietly, even without leaving us a fossil to find? Allow me one carefully labelled speculation here at the end. It remains entirely possible, even likely, that some non-avian dinosaurs survived for days, weeks, months, perhaps even a few years after the impact. Survival is not the same as recovery. A wounded individual, still alive, is not a population. A population without working ecosystems is not a future. No confirmed fossil evidence currently proves long-term Paleocene survival of non-avian dinosaurs anywhere on Earth. The candle could have flickered for a while. The flame just never caught. There is a strange comfort in that idea, and a strange sadness too. Comfort, because it means the death of the dinosaurs was not necessarily the absolute, instantaneous wipeout we sometimes imagine. Sadness, because it means that, somewhere, the last individual of a magnificent lineage may have walked alone for a season, with no one to recognize what they were, and no one to remember them when they fell. That sets up the real question, which is the one that drives our second act. If a few dinosaurs did survive the asteroid, even for a little while, what would survival actually look like? What world were they walking into? What did the air smell like? What could they eat? Where would they hide? And why would we, 66 million years later, find it so impossibly hard to prove they were ever there at all? Part 6. The difference between survival and a fossil record. There is a quiet, important difference between two things that often get tangled up in popular stories about extinction. Extinction is biological. The fossil record is geological. They overlap, of course, but they are not the same. A species can disappear without leaving a clean stamp in the rock. A fossil can vanish from the record, while the animal that made it is still alive somewhere, breathing, eating, raising young. This gap between biology and stone is the gap into which every story like the Fassett controversy is forced to live. To think clearly about whether any non-avian dinosaurs survived the asteroid, you have to break the word survival into 3 layers. The first is individual survival. A single dinosaur somewhere on the planet lives through the impact itself. It is not killed by the blast wave, the heat, the tsunamis, the debris falling out of the sky. It is, for a while, still alive. The second is population survival. Enough individuals from a species survive in the same area, find each other, and successfully breed. A handful of survivors who never meet again is not a population. A pair that meets but cannot produce viable young is not a population either. Population survival requires not only living bodies, but a working chance at the next generation. The third is evolutionary survival. A lineage continues long enough to leave descendants that fossilize, diversify, and persist. Birds did this. The asteroid generation of avian dinosaurs found a way through the bottleneck. And 10 million years later, 20 million years later, 50 million years later, their descendants were already exploring new shapes and new niches across the planet. Fassett's claim, when you read it carefully, is not a modest claim about individual survival. He is not saying a stray hadrosaur stumbled around the ash for a week. He is implying something far stronger. He is implying that non-avian dinosaurs persisted long enough into the Paleocene to leave their bones in rocks that were forming hundreds of thousands of years after the impact. That is closer to a population claim, possibly even an evolutionary claim. And that is a much taller order than simply imagining a few survivors. To understand why proving any version of this is so difficult, you need to know about a strange, beautiful problem in paleontology called the Signor-Lipps effect. The Signor-Lipps effect, explained in plain language, says this: the last fossil you find of a group is almost never the last individual that lived. Fossils are rare events. They preserve only a thin slice of what was actually alive. So when a group disappears from the rock record, The actual extinction may have happened a little later in animals whose bodies just never got fossilized. The Florida Museum has summarized the effect well, noting that it can make truly abrupt mass extinctions look more gradual than they really were, simply because the youngest individuals are the hardest to find. Flip the logic around, though, and it carries a haunting message. If the last known fossil of a particular dinosaur is 66.1 million years old, the actual last individual might have lived a little later. We just have not found their grave. The ghost of them is in the silence at the top of the rock. That makes short-term post-impact survival, in a purely theoretical sense, fairly plausible. The asteroid did not, despite our nightmares, kill every individual on Earth in a single moment. Some animals were on the far side of the planet from Chicxulub. Some were sheltered in burrows. Some were near water, which buffered some of the heat. Some were small enough to survive on tiny scraps. Some lived in regions less devastated by the immediate blast and ejecta. Long-term survival, though, is a different beast. To imagine a non-avian dinosaur lineage hanging on for thousands or millions of years into the Paleocene, you need to imagine a long checklist being filled out in the worst possible conditions. The animals would need food in a world where photosynthesis had crashed. They would need mates, in a world where their nearest relatives might be hundreds of kilometers away. They would need nesting sites, undisturbed, long enough to incubate eggs. They would need juveniles to survive to adulthood. They would need a functioning local ecosystem with prey or plants or both, season after season. And they would need this not for one generation, but for many. Paleontologists sometimes use a phrase called a ghost lineage. A ghost lineage is a group inferred to exist from indirect evidence, even when the fossils themselves are missing. For non-avian dinosaurs after the asteroid, a ghost lineage is, at the moment, deeply speculative. We have no incontestable physical evidence of one. If someone, somewhere, were to find solid evidence of Paleocene non-avian dinosaurs, what would it look like? It is worth picturing the ideal case, because it tells you exactly what is currently missing. You would want multiple bones from multiple individuals in clearly Paleocene rock with no signs of being ripped out of older layers. You would want a mix of juveniles and adults. You would want eggshell fragments, or even better, nests, trackways pressed into Paleocene mud, coprolites, which are fossilized droppings with contents consistent with dinosaur diets. You would want independent dates from volcanic ash layers above and below. You would want a clearly recognizable KPG boundary in the rock, with the bones unambiguously above it. You would want, in short, not one suggestive bone, but a small, repeatable, multi-line case. We do not have that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. There is something uncomfortable in this. The fossil record may be too incomplete to absolutely rule out brief, local survival of some non-avian dinosaurs. It is also strong enough, when you look at the full Cenozoic, to reject any idea of large-scale, long-term dinosaur survival. There are no Paleocene tyrannosaur trackways, no Eocene hadrosaur bone beds, no Oligocene triceratops teeth. The world after 66 million years ago is well sampled. We have hundreds of formations from across the Cenozoic. We have thousands upon thousands of fossils from those rocks. The Cenozoic is the age of mammals, and the case for that is overwhelming. If non-avian dinosaurs had genuinely persisted, even in small numbers, across millions of years, somewhere on the planet, we would have seen the trace of them by now. A tooth in a riverbed, a footprint in mud, a bone in an unexpected layer. Something. The silence is not absolute proof, but it is loud. So what kind of world would survivors have been living in? What kind of planet did the asteroid leave behind? Because the answer is not as simple as a fireball. The answer is something stranger, more selective, and much harder to escape. The asteroid did not just kill, it chose. And the choices it made tell us something about which lifestyles, which body plans, which behaviors, were quietly ready for the worst day in the history of complex life. Part 7. The world after impact. Not a fireball, a filter. There is a popular image of the asteroid impact that I want to gently correct. In that image, the entire Earth is engulfed in an instant inferno. Every plant burns, every dinosaur dies. The sky is the color of fire from pole to pole. It is dramatic, and it is satisfying, and it is not quite right. The asteroid that struck what is now the Yucatan region did unleash effects beyond imagination, but the planet did not die in one moment. It died in stages. The asteroid did not act like a flamethrower. It acted like a filter. Near ground zero, the immediate effects were almost beyond words. Shock waves comparable to the most powerful earthquakes in the geological record. Mega tsunamis racing across what was then a shallow sea, slamming into coastlines for hundreds of kilometers. Blast effects, ejecta thrown high into the atmosphere and falling back as fiery debris in the immediate region, near total destruction. But the planet is large. Most of it is far from Yucatan. The truly global killer was something more subtle and far more lasting. Soot, dust, sulfur, darkness. A 2020 study found that target rock-derived soot lifted from the burning impact site contributed to a long stretch of global cooling and darkening. Sunlight was choked out. The atmosphere acted like a thick, dirty curtain. And once you choke out sunlight, you choke out the foundation of almost every ecosystem on land and in the surface oceans. Plants need sunlight. Photosynthesis is the engine that drives green life. Without it, the engine stalls. How long did the darkness last? Models vary, but a common answer is somewhere on the order of months to a year or two of severely reduced sunlight, followed by extended cooling that lasted longer. Imagine a world where, for a year, you could barely see the sun behind a haze of dust and soot. Imagine the temperature dropping. Imagine the rain turning bitter with sulfur. Imagine entire forests, already burned in the initial fires, failing to come back the next season because the seeds and saplings could not get the light they needed. Let me say that simply. Plants need sunlight. Herbivores need plants. Carnivores need herbivores. Cut off photosynthesis for long enough, and the entire land food web begins to collapse from the bottom up. The big herbivores starve first because they need so much food. The big carnivores starve next because their prey is gone. The smaller, more flexible animals last longer. This is why the asteroid acted like a filter. Certain traits tended to help. Small body size was a huge advantage. A small animal needs less food, can hide more easily, and can reproduce faster. The ability to burrow was another advantage. An underground tunnel buffers against fire, against extreme cold, against radiation, against many of the worst surface effects. Living near water helped. Aquatic ecosystems, especially freshwater systems fed by detritus, do not depend as directly on the daily sunshine as terrestrial systems do. Omnivory was a huge advantage. An animal that can eat almost anything has a much better chance than one that depends on a single food source. Slow metabolisms helped. Short generation times helped. The ability to eat seeds, insects, dead matter, or roots helped. Now, look at that filter and ask yourself the obvious question. Who passes through it? Who fits the profile? Birds do. Or at least the small, beaked, seed-eating, ground-dwelling kinds of birds do. And here we have to make one of the most important corrections in all of popular science. Birds are not dinosaur-like. Birds are dinosaurs. The Natural History Museum in London has put it in plain words. After the extinction, most dinosaurs went extinct, but the birds, who are themselves a group of dinosaurs, survived and went on to diversify into thousands of species across the world. Take that in for a moment. The robin in your garden, the chicken in the field, The hummingbird at the feeder, the seagull stealing chips on the pier. They are all small, feathered, modified theropod dinosaurs. The age of dinosaurs is not over. It is just much, much smaller and much, much louder, and it sings in the morning. Even so, not every bird survived. Many Mesozoic bird lineages also disappeared at the KPG boundary. The avian survivors were a filtered subset themselves, not a random sample. The toothy birds, the long-tailed forms, many of the experimental shapes of the Cretaceous, all went down with the rest. One of the leading ideas about why some birds made it through is the seed-eating hypothesis. Seeds are tough little time capsules of plant energy. They can sit on the ground for months, even years, surviving conditions that would kill green leaves. A small, beaked bird that could crack and eat seeds would have a food source available even in a world where forests were collapsing and ferns were beginning to take over. It is not a perfect explanation, but it fits many of the survivor profiles we see. Now, with the filter in mind, we can ask the harder question. If any non-avian dinosaurs survived briefly past the impact, what would they have looked like? Not the giants. Not the long-necked, plant-dependent monsters. Not the apex predators that needed a continuous supply of large prey. Not the specialized animals locked into one type of ecosystem. The most likely short-term survivors, in pure theory, would be small, flexible, possibly bird-like, possibly omnivorous forms, tiny scavengers, egg-eaters, burrowing types, coastal generalists. Animals, in other words, that look almost exactly like the line between birds and non-bird theropods. This is one of those moments where evolutionary biology becomes almost unbearably elegant. The line between bird and non-bird by the late Cretaceous was already blurry. Many theropod dinosaurs had feathers. Many had hollow bones. Many had wishbones. Many had sophisticated brains. The asteroid did not have to choose between dinosaurs and non-dinosaurs. It chose between sizes, between body plans, between feeding strategies. The dividing line ran straight through the dinosaur family tree, and it left only the smallest, most flexible branches still standing. So here is the cliffhanger that should make you pause. If the filter favors small, omnivorous, flexible animals, then why does the most famous attempted Paleocene dinosaur claim, the one in the Ojo Alamo, focus on hadrosaurs? Big, plant-dependent, social, herd-living duckbills, some of the least obvious survivors imaginable. Could a refuge somewhere in southern North America really have supported a few of them, hanging on long enough to leave their bones in younger rock? Or is the very mismatch a clue that something else is going on? Because if hadrosaurs do not fit the profile of likely survivors, then their presence in supposedly Paleocene rock is itself an argument against survival, and an argument in favor of reworking. The bones do not match the world they would have had to live in. Let us walk into that next. Part 8. Why hadrosaurs are the wrong survivors unless the refuge was real. If you were designing, on a piece of paper, the perfect candidate to survive the asteroid, you would not draw a hadrosaur. You would draw something small, something with feathers, something that could burrow, swim, or fly, something that could eat almost anything, something with a fast generation time, something whose offspring could mature quickly and reproduce again. You would, in essence, draw a small bird, or a small mammal, or a clever lizard. You would not draw a multi-ton plant eater that needs a flourishing forest to survive. Hadrosaurs were extraordinary animals, large bodies, often weighing several tons, complex teeth arranged in dental batteries that could shred and grind tough plant material, sophisticated social behaviors in many species, with herds, nesting colonies, and probably elaborate vocalizations, built for productive plant ecosystems, with juveniles that needed long stretches of stable food availability to grow into adults. They were, in many ways, the cattle of the late Cretaceous, beautiful, abundant, and almost entirely dependent on a thriving green world beneath them. The asteroid, attacked exactly that green world. In a Paleocene where photosynthesis stuttered, where forests collapsed in waves, where many regions were dominated by ferns and pioneer plants for thousands of years before more complex vegetation could re-establish, a multi-ton herbivore is the worst possible body plan. It needs constant calories. It needs reliable food. It needs enough plants in one area to support not just one animal, but a herd, a nesting ground, a generation of young. So when James Fassett's most famous claim centers on hadrosaurs in the Ojo Alamo, you can understand why other paleontologists raised their eyebrows. Of all the kinds of dinosaurs that might possibly slip through the filter, big duck-billed plant eaters are about as poor a candidate as you can pick. It is a bit like reading a survival novel where the only person to live through the apocalypse is a competitive eater. Possible, but it would take some explaining. Unless, of course, the refuge was real. A real hadrosaur refuge, the kind that might genuinely have allowed a small population to survive and even reproduce briefly, would have to look very specific. It would need surviving vegetation, not just sad shoots, but enough plant matter to sustain large bodies. It would probably involve fern spikes and fast-growing pioneer plants, the same kind of post-disaster plants we see in pollen records right after the KPG boundary. It would need river valleys with steady moisture, seeds, roots, decaying plant material that could feed flexible eaters even on bad days. It would need enough individuals in one place to allow breeding. It would need lower predator pressure than the late Cretaceous offered, because now there are no big cats of the dinosaur world hunting in numbers, perhaps, and it would need this stability for several generations, not just one season. Think about that last point for a moment. Several generations. A hadrosaur, by some estimates, took years to reach reproductive age. To sustain a breeding population over even a few thousand years of post-impact time, you would need not just one lucky spring of food, but decades after decades of conditions good enough to raise young. That is a tall order in any disrupted ecosystem. It is an even taller order when the disruption was global, not local. This kind of scenario is sometimes imagined by paleontologists, very speculatively, as a river refuge model, coastal lowlands, floodplains, wetlands, places with abundant water and quick-growing plants, sheltered, perhaps, by the geography of a region from the worst of the global darkening. In theory, an area like this could buffer some of the asteroid's effects long enough for a few populations of large herbivores to hold on. I want to be very, very honest with you here. This is not verified. There is no accepted fossil record proving that breeding populations of Paleocene hadrosaurs ever existed. The river refuge idea, applied to non-avian dinosaurs, is a thought experiment, not a confirmed history. If someone were ever to confirm it, what evidence would they need? You would want a Paleocene hadrosaur bone bed with multiple individuals of different ages, hatchlings or juveniles, because juveniles indicate breeding, not just survival, teeth from many individuals, suggesting a community, not a stranger. Trackways in unmistakably Paleocene sediment, because tracks cannot be reworked the way bones can. A track in mud is made by a foot pressing into that exact mud in that exact moment. Plant fossils alongside the dinosaurs that show enough food was available. Datable ash layers above and below the bone bed, locking it firmly into a known time slice. Trackways are especially important. A bone can be moved. A track cannot. If you ever found a clear, unambiguous Paleocene hadrosaur trackway with juvenile and adult prints together in well-dated rock, the case would change overnight. No such trackways have been confirmed. Now, look back at Fassett's evidence with that checklist in mind. He had bones, he had pollen, he had some degree of stratigraphic context. He had his 34-piece hadrosaur assemblage, which is genuinely interesting because associated bones suggest less transport. If that single skeleton had truly been part of a breeding Paleocene population, it would be one of the most important discoveries in the entire history of paleontology. It would rewrite textbooks. It would force museums to repaint their walls. But the counterpoint is also real. Even associated bones in a fluvial system are not airtight. A river can rip up a partial carcass from old rock, transport a block of it more or less intact, and redeposit it without scattering the bones too far. A floodplain can bury a body that was carried in from upstream. The fact that 34 pieces stayed near each other tells us something about taphonomy, but it does not, by itself, tell us about the time of death. Closeness of bones is suggestive, not decisive. So the question that crackles at the heart of this part of the story is this: did Fassett uncover the rarest possible discovery, a true refuge of late survivors in southern North America? Or did the rivers of the Ojo Alamo create a near-perfect illusion of one? There is no easy answer. The current scientific consensus leans toward illusion. The bones, by this view, are real. The animals were real. They simply lived earlier than the rock around them suggests. The rivers did the rest. Because if hadrosaurs are the wrong survivors, the obvious next question becomes a much bigger one. If not them, who? Which animals genuinely matched the post-impact filter? Which ones do we know, beyond any doubt, walked through the dark and lived to see the morning of the new world? The answer is fascinating, and in some ways much weirder than the dinosaur story itself, because the survivors are not always who you would expect. Some of them you have probably eaten. Some of them you have probably petted. Some of them you almost certainly have in your house right now. Part 9. The survivors that actually match the filter. Step away from the dinosaurs for a moment and look at the strange, mismatched group of animals that genuinely walked, swam, slithered, and crawled their way through the KPG disaster. The American Museum of Natural History, in their summary of the event, lists the survivors with admirable plainness: birds, crocodilians, frogs, salamanders, lizards, mammals, snakes, turtles. All of these had lineages that came out the other side. It is not an obvious list. It is also not a fair list, in the sense that it does not always match what you would predict on body size alone. Some of these survivors were small, yes, but some were not small at all. Crocodilians, for example, included some seriously large animals, and they made it through. The pattern is not as simple as small good, big bad. It is more like flexible good, fragile bad. The animals that survived had lifestyles that could absorb the shock of a collapsing food web. The animals that did not survive were locked into specific roles that simply could not be filled in the new world. Take the crocodilians. By all rights, in a world where photosynthesis crashed and food chains collapsed, large reptilian predators should have been in deep trouble. And yet, somehow, ancient crocodilian lineages came through. Why? Several reasons, all of which line up nicely with our filter. They were semi-aquatic, which meant they could live on a mix of fish, carrion, and detritus from freshwater ecosystems, which were less directly hit than the green sunlit terrestrial food webs. They had the ability to go for long periods without food, sometimes shockingly long. Their metabolism is more flexible than that of a hot-blooded land predator. They were adept scavengers, willing to eat whatever death floated downstream. Freshwater systems, fed by decomposing material, were more buffered against the photosynthetic crash than open landscapes. Turtles passed through the filter for similar reasons: aquatic and semi-aquatic, generally low metabolic rates. Flexible diets, with many species happy to eat plants, fish, insects, or carrion. Their shells, while not magic shields, gave juveniles an extra bit of protection in a chaotic world. Turtles are old, older than many dinosaur lineages. They had survived disasters before. They would survive this one. Mammals were beautifully suited to the new world. They were small. Most early mammals during the late Cretaceous were already used to living in the shadows, often nocturnal, often burrowing, often clever enough to find food in places where the giants overhead simply could not look. Omnivory was widespread. Insect eating was widespread. fast reproduction, compared to large dinosaurs, meant that even modest local populations could rebound quickly when conditions stabilized. The asteroid did not invent the age of mammals. It just opened a door that mammals had been crowding behind for 100 million years. A wonderful recent example brings this whole picture to life. In 2026, researchers at the University of Washington reported a new mammal called Cimolodon desosai, found in Baja California. It was a tiny creature, roughly the size of a golden hamster, that probably moved both on the ground and up into trees, eating fruits and insects. The genus Cimolodon belonged to a group called multituberculates, sometimes nicknamed the rodents of the Mesozoic, although they are not actually rodents. Multituberculates are deeply tied to mammal survival through the KPG event. They were small. They were generalists. They were everywhere. They are exactly the kind of animal you want in your corner when the world ends. Compare that little hamster-sized omnivore to a multi-ton hadrosaur, and you can almost see the filter doing its work in real time. Cimolodon needed crumbs. Hadrosaurs needed feasts. Crumbs were available after the asteroid. Feasts, for a long time, were not. And then, of course, there are the birds, the true dinosaur survivors, the lineage that actually made it through. Among the hauntingly beautiful pieces of evidence here is Vegavis ei, a roughly 69-million-year-old fossil from the area of Antarctica, whose skull suggests that traits we associate with modern birds were already in place before the asteroid. Modern bird lineages did not appear out of nowhere in the Paleocene. Their ancestors were already there, already small, already feathered, already carrying the tools that would let some of them slip through the bottleneck. There is something deeply provocative about Antarctica showing up in this story. Today we think of it as a frozen wasteland. In the late Cretaceous, it was milder, partly forested, and home to a strange polar fauna of its own. Some paleontologists have wondered, very speculatively, whether high-latitude regions, polar wetlands, isolated islands, and remote river systems might have served as partial refuges where certain lineages could endure conditions a little longer than they could elsewhere. Maybe some birds rode out the worst of it in just such a refuge. Maybe a stray, non-avian dinosaur did too. The fact that Vegavis, a bird with surprisingly modern features, is found in Antarctic rocks before the asteroid is exactly the kind of evidence that opens those questions. It tells us that modern bird ancestors were already there, already living at the edge of the world before the worst happened. That is the kind of detail that turns an ordinary fossil into a clue. It does not solve the mystery. It just makes the mystery interesting in new ways. But survival, in every case we can actually verify, depended not on luck, but on ecology, on having a body and a lifestyle that fit the new world, on being the kind of animal that could eat seeds when leaves were rare, that could shelter when the sky was dim, that could afford to wait through the long winter of the early Paleocene. The asteroid did not pick winners by lottery, it picked them by profile. It selected for bodies and behaviors that could survive a darkened Earth. That is why the eventual survivor list reads the way it does. Birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, insects, certain fish lineages, not random, filtered. There is a haunting symmetry in that list when you stop and look at it. The survivors are essentially the founding members of the modern world. The mammals that came through became us, and our cats, and our cows. The birds that came through became every songbird, every parrot, every penguin. The amphibians that came through became every frog you have ever heard at night near a pond. The insects that came through became, somewhere along the way, the bees that pollinate our crops, the butterflies in our gardens, and the cockroaches in our kitchens. The world we live in today is, in a very real sense, the survivor's world. The asteroid emptied a planet, and the descendants of the animals that fit through its narrow filter rebuilt it. So what does the most plausible surviving dinosaur scenario actually look like when you put all of this together? What does honest paleontology say about the question that gives this whole story its name? That answer is what we tackle next. Part 10. The most plausible surviving dinosaur scenario. Let us answer the title question directly and rank the answers by how confident we can be. What happened to the dinosaurs that survived the asteroid? The simplest, most scientifically confirmed answer is also the most surprising one for many people. They became birds. The avian dinosaurs found a way through, and their descendants are everywhere on the planet today. There are more bird species than there are mammal species. They live on every continent, including Antarctica. They sing in your garden. They circle your beaches. They follow your fishing boats. They are, biologically speaking, the dinosaurs that won. That is the top of the confidence pyramid. Beneath it, the certainty drops in stages. The next layer down is also considered very likely by mainstream paleontology. Most non-avian dinosaurs died rapidly as ecosystems collapsed during and after the impact. The big herbivores, the apex predators, the long-necked giants, the armored tanks, the horned grazers, the whole magnificent menagerie that ruled the late Cretaceous, faded out of the fossil record at or very near the KPG boundary. The collapse was not necessarily instant in every population on every square kilometre of the planet, but within a few generations, in most regions, they were essentially gone. Below that, things get more uncertain. It is possible, but unconfirmed, that a few non-avian dinosaur individuals or small populations survived briefly after the impact in particular refuges. Days, weeks, maybe years, hard to prove, hard to disprove, allowed by the fossil record because of its known incompleteness. Below that lies a much more controversial layer, the idea that large non-avian dinosaurs survived for hundreds of thousands of years into the Paleocene. This is where Fassett's claim about hadrosaurs in the Alamo lives. It is not currently accepted by the mainstream scientific community. The evidence has been challenged, the dating has been disputed. Alternative explanations involving reworking remain plausible. And below that, sitting in the basement of confidence, is anything resembling long-term evolutionary persistence of non-avian dinosaurs into the later Paleocene or beyond. There is no fossil record of Eocene tyrannosaurs. There are no Oligocene triceratops. There is no point in the Cenozoic where suddenly, somewhere, a non-avian dinosaur lineage is found alive and well, hidden somewhere in the world. As far as the rocks tell us, that simply did not happen. What might brief survival have looked like then? Picture it in stages. In the hours and days after impact, certainly some non-avian dinosaurs, far from Yucatan, were still alive. The blast was enormous, but the planet is bigger. Animals on the far side of the world from Chicxulub did not feel the immediate fireball. They felt the climate effects later, through cooling, darkness, and food chain collapse. Almost certainly, some individual dinosaurs on the far side of the planet survived the first weeks. In the months and years that followed, plausible but harder to prove, as the darkness deepened and persisted, food collapsed for large bodies first. A lone surviving animal in a wrecked ecosystem can hang on for a while but will not breed. In decades or centuries, possible but speculative, small, geographically isolated populations might have endured in unusually buffered locations. Without ongoing breeding success across many generations, they would still vanish. In hundreds of thousands of years, you cross into Fassett's claim, and you cross into the territory where the evidence simply has to be airtight. And currently, in mainstream paleontology, it is not. Here is something that might surprise you. Even a few years of non-avian dinosaur survival in a few corners of the world would probably leave no clear fossil record. Fossilization is an extraordinary, lucky process. Most animals that ever lived were never fossilized. Most fossils that did form have been destroyed by erosion, metamorphism, or have simply not been found. Post-impact ecosystems were chaotic. Exposed terrestrial rocks from the very first windows after the KPG boundary are limited. Even if survivors existed, the silence of the rock record is exactly what we would expect. So picture this final, honest, careful image. Somewhere far from Chicxulub, a small group of battered dinosaurs walks through the ash-streaked remains of their world during the first quiet seasons of the Paleocene. They move along a river. They find a pocket of green. They eat. They sleep. They look up at a sky that no longer fills them with anything they can name. And then, over months or years, without enough food, without enough mates, without enough recovery in the ecosystem around them, they fade. They die alone or in small groups. Their bodies do not all fossilize. Some of them, perhaps, become bones that are later eroded into Paleocene sand, where, if they are ever found, they look exactly like reworked Cretaceous bones, because that is what reworking looks like. Now contrast that quiet ending with the other side of the story, with the small, feathered, beaked descendants of theropods who, somehow, made it. Birds did not just survive, they diversified. They invaded niches. They evolved into hawks and parrots and penguins and ostriches. They became, by sheer count of species, more successful in the Cenozoic than the giant non-avian dinosaurs ever were in the Mesozoic. Even if Fassett was wrong, his case still mattered. It forced the field to sharpen its methods. It forced a re-examination of assumptions about the latest Cretaceous of the American Southwest. And it produced, indirectly, the kind of careful, multi-method work that led, decades later, to the 2025 Nashoibito results. Reuters, summarizing those results, noted that the study authors found no clear sign that those animals were in long-term trouble. They were, by the rock's best testimony, the last of their world, but not necessarily a fading remnant of it. The mystery, then, does not resolve into a simple no, it resolves into a more careful answer. Some dinosaurs survived as birds. Non-avian dinosaurs may have briefly endured here and there, in small numbers, in lucky places. But no verified fossil evidence yet shows any of them rebuilding a lasting Paleocene world. The deeper we look, though, the more we realize the fossil record itself is full of missing chapters. And those missing chapters, both at the end of the dinosaur story and at the beginning, are starting to be filled in, not by accident, by new methods, by new tools, by new field sites in countries that, until recently, were not part of the global paleontological conversation, by scientists who refuse to assume that the textbook is finished, by every field season that turns up something nobody quite expected. So pause for a moment. Look up. The next time you see a sparrow on a branch, remember that you are looking at a small, modified theropod dinosaur, descended from animals that walked the Earth before the asteroid, that fit through the worst filter in the history of complex life, and that have been building a new chapter of the dinosaur story for 66 million years. They are still writing it. We are just visitors in their world. Part 11. The Missing Beginning. Dinosaurs may have originated earlier than their fossils show. For all of its drama, the Alamo controversy is really just one example of a much larger truth in paleontology. The fossil record is incomplete in both directions. At the end of the dinosaur story, we may be missing the very last survivors. At the beginning, we may be missing the very first dinosaurs. The book has gaps in the front pages and gaps in the back pages, and the only way to read it honestly is to admit those gaps exist. In 2026, a study published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B added a startling new wrinkle to this idea. By analysing 9 separate morphological datasets, the research team estimated that dinosaurs may have actually emerged sometime between 250 and 240 million years ago. That is roughly 10 million years earlier than the oldest unambiguous dinosaur fossils currently known. Take a second to feel that. 10 million years. Older than the oldest bone we have ever pulled out of the ground. According to this analysis, dinosaurs were already doing something, somewhere, while the rocks were not paying attention. This matters for the theme we have been chasing across this entire story. Absence of fossils is not absence of life. Just because we have not found something does not mean it was not there. To understand how a study can claim this without new bones, you need a quick word about morphological datasets. Imagine a giant spreadsheet. Down the side, every species in your study. Across the top, hundreds of anatomical traits. The shape of the hip socket, the number of fingers, the presence or absence of certain skull bones, the proportions of the limbs, the angle of certain joints. Researchers fill in this enormous matrix, then use computer algorithms to test which species are most closely related and how long ago their common ancestors lived. Combine this with rocks of known ages, and you can estimate when key splits in the family tree must have happened, even if no fossils have yet been found from those exact moments. Why might early dinosaur fossils be especially rare? Several reasons. The earliest dinosaurs were probably small and lightly built, the kind of animal that fossilizes only under unusually good conditions. Triassic rocks of the right age and right environment are not exposed everywhere. Many early dinosaurs probably lived in tropical or subtropical environments that were not great for preservation, and, frustratingly, they were often very similar to their close non-dinosaur relatives, so when bones do turn up, classifying them is hard. Now, connect this to the end of the Cretaceous and to our New Mexico mystery. At both ends of the dinosaur story, the same sneaky pattern shows up. The fossil record may be missing the moments we want most. The first dinosaurs, hidden by rock that did not preserve them. The last dinosaurs, possibly hidden by the chaotic, eroded mess of the immediate post-impact world. In both cases, what we see in stone may not be the full timeline of what actually lived. Paleontologists have a phrase for this kind of inferred but unseen population: a ghost lineage. A ghost lineage is a stretch of evolutionary time when a group must have existed based on the position of younger and older relatives in the family tree, but during which we have no actual fossils to point to. The dinosaurs themselves, by this morphological analysis, may have a 10 million year ghost lineage at their very beginning, and, much more controversially, they may have a much shorter ghost lineage at their very end, if any non-avian forms truly survived briefly past the KPG boundary without leaving recognizable bones. There is something almost mind-bending about this when you sit with it. The dinosaur lineage may have begun in the long shadow of an earlier disaster, the end Permian extinction. That earlier event, 252 million years ago, was the single worst extinction in Earth's known history, sometimes called the Great Dying. It nearly wiped out life in the oceans and devastated land ecosystems. If dinosaurs first appeared shortly after that catastrophe, they spent millions of years as small, marginal players in a recovering world before they ever became dominant. That gives the dinosaur story a strange and beautiful symmetry. They rose after a global catastrophe, the end Permian event. They were ended by another one, the Chicxulub impact. A whole extraordinary clade, born in disaster and snuffed out in disaster, with everything spectacular about them happening in the long, lucky pause between. Their entire reign, from first humble Triassic ancestor to last duckbill standing on a sunlit floodplain, played out in the gap between two of the worst days in the history of complex life on this planet. That symmetry should make any thoughtful person pause. We tend to think of mass extinctions as the closing pages of one story, but they are also often the opening pages of another. The animals that walk the earth today are, almost without exception, descendants of survivors. Every great ecological revolution rests on top of an earlier ecological tragedy. The age of mammals is built on the ashes of the dinosaur world. The dinosaur world was built on the ashes of an earlier one, and the earlier one was built on the ashes of the world before that. Allow me one carefully labeled speculation. If these morphology-based estimates are correct, then for 10 million years of the Triassic, somewhere on the supercontinent Pangaea, very small, possibly fast-moving, possibly two-legged proto-dinosaurs were already part of the world, still figuring out who they were going to be. They had no idea that the giants they would eventually produce would one day shake the ground for over 150 million years. They had no idea that the asteroid was already, in some sense, on its way. And neither, of course, did the people who first found their fossils. Fossils do not just reveal animals. They reveal who gets to study them, who gets to interpret them, who gets to control the story of life on Earth. Because behind every spectacular discovery sits a museum, a country, a law, a research budget, and a long, complicated set of ethical questions. The Fassett controversy could not have happened without years of access to specimens, locality records, prep histories, and independent field checks. Without that access, every controversial claim in paleontology becomes harder to test, and every unusual fossil becomes a kind of locked door. That brings us to a fossil that is, even now, walking back home from one continent to another, a skull that has its own quiet thriller hidden inside it. Part 12. The Irritator Skull and the New Fossil Politics. Allow me to turn the camera, briefly, away from New Mexico and onto a fossil with one of the most amusing names in all of paleontology. Irritator challengeri, a roughly 113 million-year-old spinosaurid skull from Brazil, currently held by the Stuttgart Natural History Museum in Germany. On May 2, 2026, The Guardian reported that Stuttgart had agreed to return this skull to Brazil after years of restitution pressure. Behind that quiet news item lies a much bigger story. A story about who owns prehistory, who controls it, who studies it, and what happens when those answers do not all line up. The story matters because, at this very moment, dozens of similar conversations are unfolding around the world. Specimens that left their countries of origin many decades ago are being requested home. Museums are reckoning with how their collections were assembled. Paleontology, like archaeology before it, is going through a long overdue conversation about the past of the past. Why does this belong in our story about Ojo Alamo and the survivors of the asteroid? Because every controversial claim in paleontology rests on access. Access to specimens, access to the rocks, access to the localities, access to data, access to independent labs willing to test other people's work. When that access is uneven, when fossils sit in one country's museum but came out of another country's ground, the entire process of scientific check and recheck gets distorted. Let me give you the human background, because it is genuinely strange. The Irritator skull was bought by the German Museum in 1991. When scientists later studied it, they realized the snout had been altered. Apparently, before sale, someone had artificially extended the front of the skull, presumably to make it more impressive looking and more valuable. When the truth came out, the researchers gave the species a name that quietly captured their feelings. Irritator, because it irritated them. Challengeri, in honor of a fictional explorer from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World stories. So here you already have layers. A real fossil, scientifically important. A doctored snout, which fooled the buyers. A name that turns frustration into permanent taxonomy. And a skull that, by all evidence, never had clear, legal export from Brazil in the first place. Fossil ethics, in plain terms, comes down to a few simple questions. Where was the specimen originally found? Was it exported legally, under the laws of the country of origin? Who prepared it? And what did they do to it? Who has access to study it? And on what terms? And critically, who actually benefits from the science the specimen makes possible? Those questions sound abstract until you connect them to a controversy like Fassett's. Imagine, hypothetically, that a key fossil at the heart of an extraordinary claim, like Paleocene non-avian dinosaurs, was held by a single institution that limited access. Imagine that independent laboratories had a hard time getting samples for fresh dating. Imagine that locality information was vague, and that other researchers could not easily walk into the field and check the rocks for themselves. The science would suffer. The controversy would deepen. The answer would never be clean. Brazil is one of the countries that has, over many decades, tried to address this kind of imbalance. Brazilian fossils have been considered state property under a 1942 law. After 1990, exporting Brazilian fossils legally requires permits and scientific partnership. Many famous specimens, still housed abroad, were taken out before those rules were strictly enforced or enforced at all. The return of Irritator is one part of a slow, complicated effort to balance the books. This is not just a Brazilian story. Restitution debates are happening in Mongolia, in Morocco, in Argentina, in many other fossil-rich countries that, historically, watch their best specimens leave for European or North American museums. The conversation is gradually shifting toward keeping fossils in their countries of origin, building local research infrastructure, and partnering across borders rather than extracting across them. Why does this affect every paleontological mystery, including ours? Because the future of claims like Fassett's depends entirely on whether the next generation of researchers can replicate the work. Future tests of the Alamo question will need access to specimens, ash layers, and locality data. They will need permission to sample bones for new dating methods. They will need to compare the chemistry of bones in the Alamo with the chemistry of bones from the Kirtland Formation, and from anywhere else those bones might originally have come from. The more open and shared paleontology becomes, the easier these tests get. There is another, quieter point worth making. Paleontology is not just fieldwork. It is also law, museums, colonial history, national identity, indigenous knowledge, and trust. Every fossil has a chain of custody. Every chain of custody has people. People working in the desert with brushes. People at port authorities checking export forms. People in museums building collection databases. People in lawmaking bodies drafting heritage protections. People in indigenous communities whose ancestral lands have produced some of the most important fossils on the continent. Allow me a labelled speculation here. As fossil politics continues to mature, future impossible survivor claims will probably hinge less on a single charismatic researcher's interpretation, and more on whether specimens are accessible enough that independent labs around the world can retest them with new methods. The mystery will not go away. It will become more democratic. More eyes will check the bones. More machines will read the rocks. Imagine a near future where every important fossil has a global digital twin, a high-resolution scan, accessible to researchers anywhere, with associated geochemistry, locality information, and prep history all attached. Imagine that the next time someone proposes a Paleocene dinosaur, they can hand the entire dataset to anyone willing to look. Imagine that competing labs can run their own dating, their own taphonomic analysis, their own interpretation, and that the consensus that emerges is built on something stronger than any one person's eye. There is a strange poetry in the fact that Irritator, of all fossils, became part of this larger story. A skull whose snout was secretly modified before sale, whose name was chosen out of frustration, and whose return to Brazil after 35 years now stands as a small marker in a much larger correction. Every reckoning in modern paleontology, every painful renegotiation between museums and source countries, ultimately moves the field toward the same goal that Fassett's controversy has always demanded: better data, cleaner provenance, independent verification, fossils held openly enough that the truth can be wrestled out of them by anyone willing to do the work. Consider, too, how all of this loops back to the question of survival. If the most extraordinary claim in dinosaur paleontology, that a few non-avian dinosaurs may have walked into the Paleocene, is ever going to be either confirmed or finally laid to rest, It will not be settled by one more solitary expedition. It will be settled by a fully connected scientific community, sharing samples, sharing data, sharing methods, and quietly tearing apart each other's interpretations until only the strongest one remains standing. That is not a weakness of science. That is its strength. While politics reshapes who studies the past, new fossils are also reshaping what the last dinosaur world looked like outside North America. Because if you only listen to the Hell Creek and the Alamo stories, you might think the late Cretaceous world ended only there. It did not. Continents away, on the edge of the African continent, an entirely different last act drama was playing out, with its own cast and its own characters. And one of those characters has just been named. Part 13, Morocco's Phosphatodon and the Hidden Diversity Before Extinction. Travel from the dry badlands of New Mexico to the phosphate basins of Morocco. The rocks here, mined in the modern day for fertilizer, also preserve one of the most important late Cretaceous fossil records anywhere on Earth. Most people have never heard of these basins. Most popular dinosaur stories never mention them. And yet, in 2026, they delivered a new sauropod species that quietly reshapes how we should think about the end of the dinosaur age. Picture, for a moment, the geography of late Cretaceous Africa. The Atlantic Ocean was much narrower then. Africa and South America had only relatively recently been pulled apart. North Africa, where Morocco now sits, was bordered by a warm, shallow sea that stretched across what is now the Sahara and beyond. The phosphate-rich sediments that record this lost world were laid down at the edges of that sea in coastal environments where bones, teeth, and shells could be buried and preserved. The mining industry, hungry for phosphate fertilizer, has accidentally exposed kilometers of fossil-bearing rock that paleontologists are still working their way through. Its name is Phosphatodon cauribgiensis, a new titanosaurian sauropod reported in 2026 from late Maastrichtian phosphate deposits near Cauribga in Morocco. The Maastrichtian, just to set the timeline, is the very last age of the Cretaceous. When you hear late Maastrichtian, you should picture the final 1,000,000 or 2,000,000 years before the asteroid, Phosphatodon, was alive, somewhere on the African landmass, in that final window. Why does this matter for our story? Because most of the popular conversation about the end of the dinosaurs focuses on North America, especially Hell Creek in Montana and the Dakotas, and to a lesser extent, the San Juan Basin. Those rocks are wonderful, but they are not the world. Dinosaurs were a global group. They lived across every continent that existed at the time. The end Cretaceous record outside North America has been historically thinner, less studied, and sometimes simply less well preserved. That has skewed our picture of how the dinosaur age ended. The authors of the Phosphatodon paper argued that this new sauropod, together with hadrosaurids also found in Moroccan rocks of the same age, suggests that Morocco supported a unique, endemic dinosaur fauna in the latest Cretaceous. Endemic, here, simply means a fauna that evolved in a specific region and became distinct from the faunas elsewhere. The animals in Morocco were not just smaller versions of North American animals. They had their own evolutionary character, their own combinations of features, their own history. Now connect this back to the Narshoy Beto and Ojo Alamo debate. If the late Cretaceous world was a patchwork of regional, endemic faunas, each with its own quirks, then the question of whether dinosaurs were declining before the asteroid does not have a single global answer. It might have many regional answers. North America may have shown one pattern, South America another, Africa another, India another, Australia another. The end of the dinosaur age was not one worldwide story. It was a quilt of stories, some thriving, some stressed, some poorly sampled. It also helps to remember that the late Cretaceous world looked very different from a map of today. Sea levels were extremely high in the late Cretaceous. Many of the continents were flooded by shallow seas. North America itself was split by an enormous inland waterway called the Western Interior Seaway. Africa, India, and South America were separated by oceans in ways that had only formed in the previous tens of millions of years. The high seas turned what would today be one continuous landmass into a chain of large islands. Island-like landmasses meant isolated faunas. Isolated faunas meant unique evolution. Unique evolution meant that the same global stress, like the asteroid impact, would have hit different regional ecosystems in different ways. Allow me a labeled speculation here. Some of those isolated regions may have had ecological conditions that made very short-term survival of certain dinosaur lineages a little more plausible than in other places. A lush, coastal lowland, sheltered, supplied with rivers far from Yucatan, a polar wetland on what is now Antarctica, a high-latitude floodplain in southern South America. None of this proves that Paleocene non-avian dinosaurs existed. But it does mean that, when we ask the question, we should not just look at one or two famous formations, we should look across the world. What Morocco's Phosphototitan really teaches us, in the bigger scheme, is humility. The end of the dinosaur age was a global event, but it played out across a planet with regional differences as deep as anything that exists today. A documentary that focuses only on Hell Creek is telling part of the story. A documentary that focuses only on the San Juan Basin is telling another part. Until we have similar quality data from many regions across many continents, we cannot pretend we know the full plot. The picture that is slowly forming, when you put all of these new fossils together, looks something like this. The late Cretaceous was not a single monoculture of dinosaurs slowly fading. It was a planet of distinct dinosaur worlds. Some of them, like the Nashoibito community, look healthy and complex right up to the end. Some of them, like Morocco, show real endemic diversity that we are only beginning to map. Some of them, like Hell Creek, show patterns that may include local declines for certain groups. The asteroid, when it came, hit all of these worlds at once, and every single one of them changed, drastically, within an evolutionary heartbeat. This makes the question of survival even harder to answer, because if some local worlds were thriving and some were stressed, then short-term survival in some pockets, after impact, becomes more imaginable. Whether any of those pockets actually held on long enough to leave a fossil record, we still do not know. Phosphototitan, in some ways, is a small thing, a new sauropod species among many sauropod species, a new chapter in a book that already has many chapters, but it carries an outsized message. The story of the last dinosaurs is bigger than any one country. The story of their disappearance is bigger than any one continent. The fossil record is being rewritten not in a single famous formation, but in basins, quarries, and outcrops scattered all over the planet. Every new fossil shifts the picture a little. Every new species adds a little more nuance. The texture of the late Cretaceous world keeps coming into sharper focus the more places we look. Africa is not the only place whose dinosaurs are being rewritten by new finds. Across the same continent, in the older rocks of the mid-Cretaceous, an iconic predator has just changed shape again, and the river systems where it lived have something quietly haunting to do with our New Mexico mystery. Part 14, Spinosaurus mirabilis and the predator that rewrites the river world. There is a particular kind of dinosaur that fascinates almost everyone who hears about it. A creature with a long, crocodile-like snout, a sail or fin running down its back, and the apparent habit of hunting in rivers rather than on the open plain. That dinosaur is Spinosaurus, and in 2026, the world of paleontology was given a new species in this strange family. Spinosaurus has had one of the strangest stories in modern paleontology. The original specimen, found in Egypt in the early 20th century, was destroyed during the Second World War when the Munich museum housing it was bombed. For decades, the only records we had were a few drawings and notes. Then, slowly, new material began to emerge from North Africa. Each new discovery added another argument to a debate that has continued fiercely for years. What kind of animal was this exactly? A 2026 paper in the journal Science described Spinosaurus mirabilis, a close relative of the famous Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, found in the same Saharan rock systems as its older cousin. These are environments that existed in what is now North Africa during the mid-Cretaceous, roughly 100 million years ago, give or take. Now you might ask, fairly, what a giant Saharan fish-eater has to do with a duckbill controversy in New Mexico. The link is not the animals themselves. The link is what the new species teaches us about how quickly dinosaur ecology can change in our minds when fresh material appears. Spinosaurids have been at the center of one of the most heated debates in modern paleontology. The questions sound almost philosophical. Were these animals deep-water swimmers, paddling after prey like aquatic hunters? Were they shoreline waders, like enormous, scaly herons? Were they generalist predators that occasionally hunted fish but mostly behaved like any other large theropod on land? Were they specialized fish eaters? Were they semi-aquatic ambush predators? At various points in the last decade, each of these answers has been argued, supported by evidence, and then questioned by new evidence. Some researchers have pointed to dense bones, suggesting an animal designed to walk on the bottom of rivers like a hippopotamus. Others have pointed to anatomical features that look poorly suited to true underwater pursuit, suggesting more of a wading lifestyle. Computer models have been built, bone density has been measured, tail biomechanics have been simulated. The debate continues. It is, in a friendly, scientific way, one of the great long-running arguments of modern dinosaur research. Spinosaurus mirabilis adds another character to that argument. With each new specimen, our model of how spinosaurids actually moved through their world shifts, sometimes by a little, sometimes by quite a lot. The bigger, more honest message here is that dinosaurs, even very famous ones, were ecologically more complicated than the simple stereotypes we learn as children. They were not all big land reptiles plodding around dry plains. Some of them lived in rivers. Some of them lived in floodplains. Some of them swam, or at least waded, often. Rivers, in fact, have been a quiet hero of this whole story. River systems are also at the center of the Alamo problem. Rivers preserve fossils, sometimes beautifully, when they bury bodies quickly under fine mud. Rivers also destroy fossils when they erode floodplains and tear bones to pieces. Rivers move fossils when they pluck old bones out of one rock and carry them downstream into a younger one. Rivers create context, and rivers ruin context. They are the great editors of preservation. Imagine, for a moment, a single river running across the late Cretaceous floodplain of New Mexico. Big river, slow loops, sandbars, fallen trees, mosquitoes, thick over the water. A duck-billed dinosaur, tired or sick, walking down to drink. It dies. Its body is buried by a flood. Time passes, then more time. The river shifts, changes course, comes back again, abandons that channel, finds a new one. Now imagine a different scene. A different late Cretaceous river, hundreds of thousands of years later, cutting into older rock, ripping out an old fossil bone, carrying it downstream, dumping it into a new sandbar that is forming in what will, eventually, be called the Alamo sandstone. Both scenes leave fossils. Both fossils end up in roughly the same kind of rock. Both look, to a future paleontologist, like dinosaur bones in sandstone. But only one of those scenes is a story of an animal living in that age. The other is a river simply being a river, doing what rivers always do. Allow me a careful, labelled speculation. If any non-avian dinosaurs survived, even briefly, into the early Paleocene, river corridors and wetlands would be among the most likely places to find evidence. The very environments that buffered the worst of the photosynthetic crash, that supported plants and insects and small animals, that gave water-loving creatures a chance to hold on. River systems would also be among the very places where reworking is hardest to rule out. The same environments that might, in theory, host real survivors are the same environments that, in practice, are most likely to mix bones from different ages together. That is the cruel symmetry of the river. It is both the best place to look for survivors and the worst place to be sure that what you have found is a survivor. We have, in this part of the story, found ourselves staring at two river mysteries at once. With Spinosaurus mirabilis, the question is what the animal was doing in the river. With Alamo's hadrosaurs, the question is what the bone was doing in the river sandstone. Different questions, same setting, both unsolved. Each new spinosaurid specimen reminds us that even a well-studied dinosaur can suddenly show new sides of its biology when a new fossil appears. Each new analysis of New Mexico rocks reminds us that even a heavily studied formation can reveal new chronologies when better dating is applied. The Book of Life on Earth is not a closed volume. It is a living manuscript, with margins still being filled in by every careful researcher willing to pick up a pen and a hammer. Which leaves a question for the very end of our journey. If field discoveries keep changing the picture, and if the fossil record itself is so full of gaps, what new tools might one day come along to fill those gaps? What if the next great paleontological revolution is not someone walking across a desert with a brush in their hand, but a machine quietly running deep inside a wall of rock, looking for things human eyes have missed? What if the future of fossil hunting has less to do with finding new sites and more to do with re-examining the rocks we have already collected, with eyes that never tire and patience that never runs out? Part 15. AI, Fossil Mining, and the Future of Hidden Lineages. Picture, for a moment, the classic image of fossil hunting. A figure crouched on a hillside in the desert, a small brush in one hand, a pick in the other. The wind, the sun, the slow, patient sweep of dust off something that has been waiting for 60 or 70 million years. That image is real, and it will not disappear. But alongside it, a very different one is starting to take shape. A technician sitting in a lab, watching a screen. On the screen, slice after slice of a digital scan of a piece of rock. An algorithm, trained on the patterns of bones and shells, quietly highlighting features inside the stone that human eyes struggled to see. Fossils, found not by pickaxe, but by code. In 2026, a paper in Communications Biology described a new fossil that had been found in exactly this way. The fossil's name is Ulluciala rotundata. It is the oldest known sepioid cephalopod, a member of the group that today contains cuttlefish and their relatives, and it was discovered using digital fossil mining and zero-shot learning AI. The fossil came from Upper Campanian to Upper Maastrichtian rocks. In plain language, those are roughly 74 to 67 million years old. So this little cephalopod was alive, swimming through ancient seas, in the same general window of geological time as the dinosaurs of the Narshoi-Beto member and the Alamo. It is part of the same final stretch of the Cretaceous, and it helped fill what had been, before its discovery, a patchy and frustrating cephalopod fossil record. What does digital fossil mining actually mean? In simple terms, it means converting rock into very high-resolution digital image data, slices of rock, scanned at high detail. Once you have those images, you can run AI-assisted methods over them, looking for shapes, textures, and patterns that match known fossils. Rather than physically chipping away at every piece of stone, you let the computer scan it virtually first, and then you only target the pieces that look promising. The phrase zero-shot learning is more technical. In simple terms, it describes an AI system that can attempt to recognize objects, even when it has not been specifically trained on them. Show it a kind of fossil it has never seen before, and it can sometimes still flag it as fossil-like, based on the general patterns it has learned. That sounds magical, but in practice it is more like a careful generalist working through a library, picking out books that look interesting based on shape, weight, and style of binding, even if they cannot read every cover. Connect this back to the central theme of our story. The fossil record is incomplete not only because fossils are missing, it is also incomplete because some fossils are present but invisible to current eyes. Locked inside rocks, overlooked, misidentified, stored in drawers in museums, waiting decades to be looked at again. AI-assisted methods, combined with scanning technology, are starting to crack open those hidden archives. Allow me a careful, labeled speculation about what this might mean for our central mystery. Future tests of the Alamo question may not look like a single new field expedition. They may look like a coordinated suite of methods, redating old specimens with newer, more precise techniques, CT scanning bone microstructure to look for evidence of post-burial chemical alteration, mapping uranium uptake patterns inside individual bones to better understand whether their dates record death or just diagenesis, testing rare earth element histories along thin sections of bone, searching for microscopic fossil traces, dinosaur footprints invisible at large scale, dinosaur skin impressions, dinosaur eggshell fragments, in rocks above the KPG boundary, using high-resolution imagery and AI-trained recognition, reconstructing sediment transport with digital models, testing whether specific bones could realistically have been moved from older units into younger ones. We are entering a period in paleontology where it is not just the scientist's eye that matters. It is the scientist's eye plus the machine's patience. An algorithm does not get tired. It does not get bored. It does not care that it has scanned 10,000 cubic centimeters of rock without finding anything. It can work on rocks from formations like the Alamo and the Nacimiento for years. It can compare patterns across continents. If real, surviving non-avian dinosaurs ever did leave fossil traces in early Paleocene rocks, the kind of traces that would be too small or too cryptic for the human eye to recognize at first glance, this is the kind of technology that might eventually find them. Or, just as importantly, fail to find them and tell us something different. Either way, we will know more. So return with me to James Fassett one last time. His Paleocene dinosaur claim remains, today unverified by mainstream consensus. The 2025 Nashoi Bito results have shifted the most likely interpretation of the New Mexico fossils away from Paleocene survivors and toward last dinosaurs before impact. Most paleontologists now believe his hadrosaurs were probably reworked. Most do not expect that picture to change soon. But Fassett also did something that mattered. He asked a question almost no one wanted to ask. He pushed his colleagues to develop better methods. He forced people to look at the same rocks twice and 3 times and 4. The science got better because he refused to let go. Where does this leave us on the question that opened our story? What happened to the dinosaurs that survived the asteroid? The dinosaurs that definitely survived became birds. They are with us today, in every garden and every sky. The alleged Paleocene hadrosaurs of the Alamo remain controversial and most likely reworked. The New Mexico evidence today points more strongly to a thriving dinosaur ecosystem in the final hundreds of thousands of years before impact, rather than to dinosaur populations after impact. Short-term survival of some non-avian individuals after the asteroid remains entirely possible and almost impossible to prove without far better evidence than we currently have. So, finally, allow me one quiet, cinematic image to end on. Somewhere in a place we have never found, far from Yucatan, in the first season after the sky stopped raining fire, A single non-avian dinosaur stands on the bank of a river. The water is grey. The trees are stripped. The air smells of ash and something older. Around its feet, ferns have already begun to push through the burned soil. Above it, a small feathered shape, a bird, one of its surviving cousins, calls out into a darkening sky. The asteroid ended the dinosaur world, but maybe not in a single heartbeat. Somewhere in the first darkness of the Paleocene, the last non-avian dinosaur may have taken one final breath. The tragedy is that stone may never have recorded it. The wonder is that somewhere, in the call of that small feathered bird, the dinosaurs are still here, still watching, still carrying, in their small hollow bones, the memory of a planet they once owned.